I mean, mainly what we're trying to do is talk about why you'd need to have government in the first place, right? Some of the things are going to goof up in terms of, even in the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, is saying that you're going to get to a Pareto efficient output. And then the question was, what about if your monopoly is at a violation of that, in that the price isn't equal to marginal cost, right? One of the three conditions of Pareto efficiency was that the margin rate of transformation has got to be equal to the margin rate of substitution, and how you got that was price equals marginal cost, right? So people who are making X and people who are making Y are both setting their price equal to marginal cost. So the marginal cost of X to Y is equal to the price of X to Y. But then you guys are facing the same price ratio, so you're setting the margin rate of substitution equal to that same price ratio, so that third condition is going to hold. But if you have a monopoly, what are they doing? They're setting their marginal revenue equal to marginal cost and not their price. And we noted that for all the, if we looked at a monopolist, you have their demand curves downward sloping, so they got marginal revenue, marginal cost, and they're going to stop here at QM, and here's Q star. And we noted that all the units between QM to Q star have a marginal benefit which is bigger than the marginal cost, so you're going to have that welfare loss. Well, the deal is that you could take the benefits to the people that are gaining and moving from here to here, and then you could pay off the monopolist, so the monopolist will be better off in the end, and so, or at least stay the same, and everybody would gain. So the gains from the winners, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, that the gains from the winners exceed the losses to the losers, then you can pay them. So the deal is that the marginal benefits, the benefits to the people from here to here are greater than basically the loss in profit that the monopolist has, and so the monopolist can be better off, or at least stay the same, and then you'd still have left over enough to make people better off. Okay. Again, the focus here is on why have a government in the first place, right? I mean, if you the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics says you're going to hit an efficient spot. When do you need government? Well, you need government when some of these things don't work out. And the first thing that doesn't work out that we briefly talked about was the monopolist, and the problem was that third condition isn't going to hold because marginal cost is going to be equal to marginal revenue rather than the price. The next thing we were looking at was externalities, right? And we said, well, what's the problem there? The problem there is that the price system isn't going to pick up the effects on the other people. So that we said, you could have a negative externality, and we said, what was that? That's where you're imposing costs on others that aren't being picked up in the price system. And you had positive externalities, and then you are providing benefits, right? And they're not being picked up in the price system. So we said, well, if I was to do Rod Stewart, and every picture tells a story, if I was to draw the story of that, if I had a negative externality, there'd be this market demand, and you have market supply, but this would be equal to the private marginal costs, but there's some external costs out there, and that's not being picked up. And so if we were to put that as the marginal cost private plus the marginal external cost, it's going to be there. And we said, well, the market's going to land you right here, but Q star is where the total marginal cost equals the marginal benefit. Remember that the market demand is what? It's the marginal benefit curve. Think back to ECON 202. And so the problem here is that you're going to get too much of the good being out there. That is, all the units between Q star and QM, they have a true marginal cost, which is up here, and their marginal benefits there. And so you've got a loss there in terms of efficiency. And we said that, well, if you did a positive externality, then what would happen is this is the private marginal benefit, but there's some external benefit that's going on. And that's going to be that plus the external. And so what's going to happen is there's the amount that's going to happen in the market, but this is the amount that would be optimal because all the units between QM and Q star, we said, are going to have that marginal benefit bigger than the marginal cost. So how can you deal with that, right? You're going to have a situation where if you have an externality, how might you deal with that so that you could get to the optimum amount? And so one way you could deal with that is you could do what's called, you could internalize the externality, okay? So I don't know how many of you know about this, but Dan Gilbert bought up a whole bunch of properties in Detroit and then started fixing them up. And so when he was deciding to fix up property A, he owned property B, which is the building next door, right? So when he's deciding how much to spend to fix up property A, he's looking at the marginal benefits from the increase in the property values from property A, and he's also considering the external benefit to property B because he owns property B. So that's what's calling internalizing the externality. And so you'll notice that if you have a city that's become blighted, it's hard to do it one house at a time, okay? But if you come in and buy up a whole neighborhood, then that's when you start to get a removal of blight. And so internalizing this externality is just basically if you own all the properties around. And so if you, actually one of my students a number of years ago got forget what, American Enterprise Institute, I believe, prize for doing a paper on blight, and particularly blight in the Detroit area, just basically looking at this very issue of, why does blight happen? Blight happens on the other side. That is, you are only deciding the value to you of fixing up your property and not thinking of, as your property is declining in value, it's bringing down the property values of the other properties around you. And so, it's difficult to deal with blight because of this very issue of externalities. And so you get blighted cities. And as I said before, how many of you knew that Dan Gilbert bought up a bunch of properties in Detroit and started fixing up? Yeah, okay. So anyway, that is, he was basically internalizing that externality. A second thing that you could do is A.C. Pagoo, who we talked about being on our Public Choice Hall of Fame. What he suggested in 1967 is that you tax the marginal external cost. Right? That if you could impose a tax on the marginal external cost, then what would happen is the person that is producing the externality would put that into their cost function, and you'd end up at the right spot. Okay? So that's what's called, guess what? A Pagoovian tax. So if you have if what you could do is you could figure out what the marginal external costs and the other people are, you could impose this tax on the person that's producing the externality, and that would cause them to put that into their cost function, and then you'd get to the optimal amount. Global warming, okay? Big talk about global warming. You probably are aware of the problems that they're having down in Louisiana, et cetera. Is that, and then there's problems out in California with wildfires and the heat out there. And there's a discussion about whether this is being caused by what? Too much carbon in the atmosphere, right? And the carbon in the atmosphere is causing a change in the weather, whether it's an extreme weather event or et cetera. And so they're saying that these extreme weather events are more frequent, and it's being caused by global warming, and global warming is being caused by too much carbon in the atmosphere. And so when you drive your car, you're putting, if you use gasoline, you're putting carbon out in the atmosphere, and you're only considering the marginal benefit to you and the marginal cost to you of driving around. You're not considering these marginal costs on somewhere else. So anybody know what they've been talking about that looks like what we just are talking about, a Pigouvian tax? Anybody? A carbon tax, right? A carbon tax. So you may have seen a discussion about imposing a carbon tax, okay? Now, that is not an odd thing to do, right? Because if you have taken public choice or public finance, we talk about it in much more detail in public finance, then this, a carbon tax fits into this idea of a Pigouvian tax. Now, in a moment, we'll come back to think about, can you actually get the right amount of the marginal external cost? Is that capable of doing? But a carbon tax would not be an outlandish thing to talk about if it fits into this idea of a Pigouvian tax. You might look at it as but you could also look at it as a Pigouvian subsidy. Whereas you would get the government may provide you with a benefit which is equal to the marginal external benefit that you're giving everybody else. So the Michigan Economic Development Corporation is a state agency, and one of the things it does is it provides grants to people who fix up buildings, rehabilitate buildings, particularly in the downtown area, so that it would make sense to do that if you said, okay, let's take just the city of Hillsdale, right? Got a $1.4 million grant to fix up the Don Theater. I don't know if you've ever been by the Don Theater, but the Don Theater is being rehabilitated, right? 1919 was when the Don Theater became a theater. With a 100th year anniversary, things got slowed because of COVID and stuff. But it's almost being fixed up, and there was, how would you justify that grant? You would say that the Don Theater being fixed up is going to provide benefits to all sorts of properties around the Don Theater, right? If it's now a functional building, people will come downtown, and then maybe they'll eat at the restaurant next door, and you also don't have this decrepit property here next to your property, etc. Same thing with the Kiefer House is a hotel that was built in 1885. And how many have been downtown? Really? That's all? You haven't been downtown Hillsdale? How many have been downtown Hillsdale? Okay, well, that looks better. Okay, like if you go downtown Hillsdale, one of the major buildings is the Kiefer Hotel, right? It was a flop house when we got here. 1965 was the last time that really was a real hotel. Well, that's being redone, okay? So why might you justify a state grant or something like that to rehabilitate the Kiefer House? Well, it would be this idea of a Pigouvian subsidy, saying, okay, when you fix up the Kiefer house, it's going to provide all these benefits to the properties around that, and so that would make sense. So we currently have government policies that would fit within this framework of a Pigouvian tax for negative externalities or a Pigouvian subsidy for positive externalities. That leads us to the idea of that Ronald Coase came about in terms when looking at externalities. So Ronald Coase was writing, in 1960, he wrote The Problem of Social Cost. And he's looking at externalities as an idea from a couple of angles. One is looking at, his paper is really about where there's a conflict of property rights, but and we'll come to this to in a moment, but externalities he'll talk about is really a property rights issue. But the first thing that he points out is if you look at the externality, the idea is that it's reciprocal in nature. And what he means by that is who is causing it. Now, you live in Hillsdale County for a big part of your life. What are the two major crops that you grow in Hillsdale County? Yeah, corn and soybeans, okay, right? And you rotate soybeans with corn, okay? But when you're growing corn and you take it down to Maumee, to where you sell your corn. So if you have a farm here in Hillsdale County, where do you take it down to Maumee to sell your corn? You get a higher price for corn if it's drier. And so what do? If you have a corn farmer, you probably have a machine that dries the corn. And guess what? Makes a lot of noise. If you are, if you're wandering around Hillsdale County during the era where there's during the time period where the farmers are drying corn, you'll hear that, okay? So let's say there's a farmer that's drying his corn and somebody buys a subdivision, buys the property next to that farmer's property and puts in a subdivision. Now what's going on is there's all sorts of noise, okay? And you own a condominium or a house in that subdivision, and what's going on? You're trying to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, and this farmer's making all this noise drying the corn. So what Coase is pointing out is who caused this externality. There's certainly a negative externality here, right? The farmer's not determining what the cost to you is of not getting a good night's sleep, or maybe the value of your property is now lower because there's all this noise going on if somebody were to buy the condominium or the house from you. So but there was no externality till you put in the subdivision, okay? So Coase's first point is it's not clear who's causing the externality. Did you cause the externality by coming in, or does the farmer causing the externality from making the noise? So that's what, the first thing that Coase points out is just, hey, it's not clear who's causing this externality, right? Again, like I said, there is no externality if there's nobody in the subdivision, but now there is. So the second thing that he points out is that really it's a property rights issue. This is what he focuses on. That is, do you have the right to dry, you're the farmer, right, and you've got your property, do you have the right to dry your corn or do I have the right to have a quiet neighborhood? Okay? There's a conflict of property rights here. And so what Coase is pointing out is a number of externalities really have to do with property rights. Do you have the right to put, you're a coal-fired power plant. Do you have the right to stick, well, in the old days, sulfur dioxide, right? You can't do that anymore, but you used to be able to put sulfur dioxide out into the atmosphere. Do you have the right to, it's your plant, it's on your property. Do you have the right to emit sulfur dioxide, making your power? Or do I have the right to clean air? Or what is sulfur dioxide when it goes out into the air and it commits with H2O? What does it turn out to? Yeah, acid rain, H2SO4, right? Turns into acid rain, sulfuric acid, right? Well, that's a problem if you got a fishery next door. Okay, so do you have the right to clean water or clean air, or do I have the right to, it's the air above my property? Do I have the right to stick stuff into it? Okay, so this is a major focus of Coase, is that basically externalities are property rights issues, and they're a conflict of property rights. So what he says is that if there are no transactions costs, then what can happen is the government will assign a property right to either party, right? So they can assign the property right to either party, and it will go to the party that values it the most. So in the absence of transactions costs, and I mean it's a little more technical, and again we do a little more of this in Econ 402, but basically if it's in a competitive market, and what he's really concerned about here is nobody has control over the price, right? There's no market power on one side. So given that people can swap the property right around, if that's the case, then the government can just give it to one party and it will go to the party that values it the most. So if you're the government and you say, we got this negative externality going on, let's go ahead and assign the property right to somebody, doesn't matter to whom. If there are no transactions costs, then what will happen is it'll end up with a party that values it the most. And just sort of think about that. Suppose that you have cascade power, right? And it saves $1,000. Saves $1,000 by letting some of its waste go into the river. Okay, reduces its cost by $1,000. Just let the waste go into the river. And suppose that there's a fishery that loses $800 from this waste. So does the fishery have the right to have the clean water, or does Cascade Power have the right to dump, the river's going through its property, can it just dump stuff into the river and reduce its cost by $1,000? Well, all the government has to do is assign the property rights to one of the parties, and if there's no transactions costs, or if there are low transactions costs, what would we expect to happen? We'd expect them to bargain with one another. Suppose that you give it to Cascade Power, right? Suppose Cascade Power gets it. Well, the fishery isn't going to buy it from them, right? Because the fishery at most will get $800 from not having the waste go into the river, and so it's going to stick with Cascade Power. Suppose that you give the right to the fishery. If you give the right to the fishery, it's worth $800 to them, but it's worth $1,000 to Cascade Power. So what's going to happen? Cascade Power is going to buy the right from the fishery. And it's going to end up with, because I mean, that's this important point about the transaction costs, right? People are going to bargain, and it will show up with the party that values it the most, which tells you that the government doesn't have to know who values it the most, okay? They're just going to have to assign the property right to somebody, and they'll bargain with one another, which means that sort of the markets will solve this thing. All that the government's got to do is go out there and assign property rights. And of course, just in general, you learned in Econ 202, you have to have property rights, okay? Or even Econ 105, we talk about you have to have property rights for markets to work. So that's sort of an interesting aspect, is that the government doesn't really have to do anything other than, in an externality situation, if there's no transactions costs, then the government just has to go out there and say, okay, you've got the property right, and then it'll go to the party that values it the most. Now, how applicable this thing is depends on how close the transactions costs are to zero, right? Maybe they're not perfect, maybe transaction costs aren't zero, but they're pretty low, and so you can be pretty sure that they're going to bargain with them on another, and it's going to go to the party that values it the most. If you had high transactions costs, then you'd have to know who values it the most, right? So if you have high transactions costs, so if the government knows who might value it the most, then what do? Then you have to assign it to that party. Suppose that you're talking about Milnes Road and US 12, okay? So there's an intersection of Milnes Road, which is a two-lane going north-south, and US 12, if you're just east of Hillsdale, if you were to go out Milnes Road, you'll see that it connects with US 12. And there's a stop sign there. And who's got the stop sign? Yeah, Milnes Road's got the stop sign, right? Probably because the value to people on US 12 of going through that intersection without having to stop is greater than the value to the people that are on Milnes Road trying to cross US 12. So there's a case where maybe the government, you sort of know this party's likely to be the one that has the highest value. We assign a property right to it, and the problem will be solved. How applicable the Coase theorem is really sort of depends on primarily where the transactions cost getting too high. Now, when I got my first vehicle, you used to be able to buy leaded gasoline, okay? And so there was lead in the gasoline. And the reason there was lead in the gasoline is because it increased your gas mileage. But what happens when you're driving around? Lead's going out the tailpipe. And I don't know if any of you have ever breathed lead for a while. It's not very good for you, okay? So driving around is a negative externality. Now, if you had the Coase theorem, and you could say, okay, you're driving your car, you'd stop at every house along the way and knock on their door and say, hey, would you mind, could I pay you $5 to be able to drive my car around with the gasoline that's got lead in it? Okay, that's just impossible, right? So the solution was the government said, hey, you don't have the right to put gasoline in your car, okay? or leaded, you don't have the right to put leaded gasoline in your car. And so you don't have leaded gasoline anymore. And so, you know, again, it's a matter of, from a public policy perspective, it's a matter of just sort of, okay, this sort of looks like transactions costs are pretty low, and so all we need to do is to assign the property right. Or I'm pretty sure who values the property right more, and I'm going to assign it to them. Or, like I said, you might say, well, we have a pretty good idea what the marginal external cost is, and so we'll do a Pigouvian tax. But the point here about coast is that it's you know, primarily externalities can be thought of as a property rights issue, and how easy is it to swap those property rights around is the point we want to make here. Now, Jim Buchanan came along, and as I said earlier, this idea of market failure, this you know, the Bator paper Anatomy of Market Failure, starting to focus on problems that the market has. Okay, monopolies, externalities, etc. But Buchanan, he looked. You know, Jim Buchanan is again one of the Public Choice Hall of Fame. He was looking at what about government failure? And again, I have as one of the readings his 1988 Cato Journal, which is in your again in your Econ 415 subfolder, called Market Failure and Political Failure. And the idea now is, can government get it right? You know, that's sort of the obvious thing. So we've read A.C. Pigou's paper, or we've had Econ 415, and we got a negative externality out there. We have a, we're going to put a Pigouvian tax on, okay? It's, you know, the carbon tax, or we have some other tax that's going to be tax the negative externality. We'll think about what the procedure might be for a Pigouvian tax, right? It's supposed to equal the marginal external cost. How does the tax, how does taxes work through the political process? Well, let's say you introduce a bill in the House of Representatives, okay? So you've introduced this tax bill in the House of Representatives. Then what happens? It's assigned to a committee, right? And then what does it do? The committee votes on it. And it might be amended or whatever. It passes the committee and it goes to the House floor. The House then votes on the bill. Then what happens? Goes over to the Senate. Put in the Senate. What does that do? Then it goes to the, let's say, the Senate Finance Committee. Then they vote on that. Then it goes to the Senate floor, right? And then it's voted on the Senate floor. You know, maybe there's amendments, whatever. And then what happens if the Senate version and the House version aren't the same? What happens? It goes to a joint committee and you get a reconciliation bill. And what happens is it comes out to the House and Senate floor and then it's either passed or not passed. The question is, if you have all this procedure going on, then what's the probability that that bill is going to show up with the tax being equal to the marginal external cost, right? Probably near zero, right? How is I supposed to figure out what the marginal external cost is of you know, like cars driving around and emitting carbon into the atmosphere, right? How do I know what the marginal external cost of a gallon of gasoline being used up, putting carbon into the atmosphere? What's the, you know, how much does that add to the carbon? How much is that adding to the carbon actually affect the global warming? How much does the global warming affect the property values or affect, you know, fires in California or whatever? Just as an aside, so old I am. I fought fire for the state of California for 6 fire seasons. And in those days, now, how many have ever seen pictures of the fires and they got planes dropping? Well, in those days, the planes that were dropping on us were B-17s, right? World War II B-17 aircraft and PBYs, old World War II aircraft, which you now only see in museums. So whenever I'm watching this on television, I'm going, oh my gosh, am I getting that old? But anyway, so how do we really figure out what that marginal external cost is, right? It's probably hard to do. But on the other hand, it gives you some guidance from a public policy perspective. If you are, Congressman Tim Walberg from this Michigan 7th District, if you're Congressman Tim Walberg, then your constituency is going to be wanting you to deal with this stuff. What is some guidance? It may be that a carbon tax may be the thing that makes the most sense, and maybe you don't get it quite right. So you're careful about how high you make the carbon tax, or you try it at a certain level, and whether that seems to be making a difference or not. Then if it's causing a cost to the economy which is very high, then maybe you amend it or whatever. But it just basically to give you some guidance on how this might work. Also, as an aside, how many of you all heard that this carbon in the atmosphere can cause all these problems, right? What if it's a lot cheaper to take the carbon out of the atmosphere instead of keeping the carbon from getting in the atmosphere, right? In fact, I don't know if you've heard of it, but Elon Musk has the X Prize. And if you look up the X Prize, there's an X Prize to remove carbon, and it's $100 million. There's a $100 million X Prize to people to figure out how to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Oops. Hope I didn't break this thing. What's going on? Yeah, okay. If you did that, now you got to think about how that's going to work. Suppose that I figure out how to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and I figure it out a way that actually you can make money doing it. For example, I do know that as part of the first round of this X Prize is that some people have figured out a way to use the carbon to do something with cement, and it somehow makes cement better or whatever. Okay, so if that were to happen, let's say I figure out a way to take the carbon out and I use the carbon to be productive, then it might be like the buffalo. That is, nobody owns the carbon, right? And so maybe you have just the opposite effect. Like 50 years from now, we got a problem that we don't have enough carbon in the atmosphere because these companies are all out there sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere in order to make cement or whatever, right? So I just find that interesting. All right. Another problem is what we call public goods. And so what is a public good? Actually, goods sort of are on a continuum between purely private and purely public. But some of the features of a public good is the main thing is they're non-rival in consumption. And what does non-rival in consumption means? It means that your usage of it doesn't affect my usage of it. Right? Your usage doesn't affect my usage. Let's say national defense. Let's say we put up an anti-ballistic missile system, okay? So let's say it's going to cost, $800 billion to do an anti-ballistic missile system around the United States. so that when, if somebody attacks us and their missiles come flying in, then we have a way of shooting them down or whatever. You now build a house. It doesn't reduce the amount of anti-ballistic missile system coverage for my house, right? If national defense has this characteristic to it that protecting my house doesn't affect protecting your house. Fireworks, right? My observing the firework doesn't preclude you from observing the firework or reduce the amount of fireworks that you have. Okay, as I think I mentioned that, on the 3rd of July in Hillsdale, if you happen to be around Hillsdale on the 3rd of July, what's a fun thing to do? To go out and watch the fireworks, because they shoot them off. The city shoots off fireworks on the 3rd of July. They don't shoot them off on the 4th of July because it's cheaper to buy the fireworks and shoot them off on the 3rd of July than to get them for the 4th of July. So anyway, but if I'm watching the fireworks, it isn't reducing the amount of fireworks available for you. So notice that doesn't mean that making another unit has a marginal cost of 0, right? It's not talking about producing the good itself, right? So this doesn't mean that the marginal cost of another unit, so it's not that the marginal cost of another unit is 0. That is, if I'm going to have more fireworks, it's going to cost something to make more fireworks. But once I've got that amount of fireworks out there, or once I've got that amount of national defense out there, then adding other people doesn't affect the amount that's available for somebody else. A second feature of public goods is they're difficult to exclude. Right? They're difficult to exclude. That is, if I shoot fireworks off into the air, it's pretty hard for me to keep you from looking at it, right? I'm not going to be able to run around and, put blinders on people that didn't pay to watch the fireworks, okay? It's also difficult to, if I build an anti-ballistic missile system, I can't exclude your house from having the protection of the anti-ballistic missile system. So a feature of public goods is that they're difficult to exclude. Now, if you thought about it, you might not want to exclude people, because if they're I already erased it, but I know that since they're non-rival in consumption, your using it doesn't affect the value to me of using it, and so I could make you better off and not make me any worse off by letting you use it, right? So from a Pareto-optimal standpoint, it wouldn't make sense to exclude people from public goods. And we all get the same amount of it, is the third major characteristic. Right? You get the same amount of national defense as I get, right? Or you get the same amount of fireworks that I get. And so that, again, mentioning Joan Baez, trying to say that she didn't want to pay a certain fraction of her taxes because she didn't want to have the Vietnam War. Okay, this is back in the 1960s and late 1960s, and so she was opposed to the Vietnam War. And what she tried to do was to to remove part of her taxes, the part that was going, some fraction that she thought was the amount going to afford the Vietnam War. But turns out you can't do that, right? Because we're all getting it, we're all getting the same amount. You get the same amount of fireworks or the same amount of national defense. Now, the purely private goods are just sort of the opposite of that, right? That is, if I'm eating a hot dog, you can't eat the same hot dog, right? And I get the hot dog, you don't get the same hot dog that I'm getting. And I can exclude you from getting hot dogs by, if you don't pay for it, you don't get to have it. So if you think about it, goods are on a continuum, right? I mean, and realistically, from purely private to purely public. And again, in Econ 402, we spend a good deal of time on these issues. But for example, you could have a good that was a swimming pool, okay? And at first, we have this big swimming pool, and you're the only one using it, okay? Somebody else comes in, doesn't really affect the amount of the swimming pool that you're using. But as you keep adding people, then what happens? It starts to get, congested, okay? And so as you start to add people, then that will happen is that now you're going to have this quality that you do have some congestion. And we could exclude you by having a club that says, if you don't join the club, you don't get to use the swimming pool. And so, again, from Econ 402, we talk a good deal about what Buchanan called club goods, right? And these are goods that have this characteristic, that is, they're congestible after a certain point. And then you'd have to decide how many people you want to let in the club, given the size of the swimming pool, and given the amount of people in the club, how big do you want to make the swimming pool, right? And so, so again, in 402, we talk a little bit more about that, in fact, a lot more about that. But the point simply is that, goods can lie on this continuum between purely private and purely public. Probably most goods that you deal with every day are purely private goods. All right, so for Friday, we'll be working our way. We're going to be finishing up these problems that you have with the market not getting you to the most efficient outcome. So there's a role for government to make public goods, national defense. That's normally that's what we have, or externalities, etc. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start on social welfare. If you look again in as I mentioned, Dave Hebert and I you've got this sort of first beginnings of a public choice textbook, chapter